Greetings, folks. It's a pleasure to be here with you. My name is Herman Singh, and it gives me great pleasure to present a keynote today at the PASA International Payments Conference. My topic for today is people in payments. And what I really wanted to do in the next 40 minutes is to home in on a few big ideas. It's a huge field, obviously, and there are many people involved in payments, ranging from, I guess, regulators to governments to consumers to merchants, etc. So where does one focus when one speaks about people in payments? And so I came up with 6 big ideas that I wanted to leave with you when one thinks about, I guess, human-centered design, the way in which we think about users and merchants and regulators and, in fact, industry players. The first point is that actually the situation that we're trying to resolve is a social problem, not a technological one. Secondly, you actually can't go your own way, and I'll explain why shortly. Thirdly, there's a number of lessons that we can learn from the way in which we address the COVID crisis that actually teaches us a lot about the way in which we're managing the payment space, and they're very relevant. We'll talk about something called prosumers. We'll talk about why collaboration is going to be a solution going forward. And of course, finally, we'll talk about how we can borrow solutions from nature. So let's look at the first big idea. The first big idea is actually payments is a social problem that we're trying to address. So idea number 1 is actually if you want to optimize the payments industry, it's a lot like cybersecurity. It's a social problem, not a technical one. There's 2 ways that you can blind someone. You can blind someone by giving them too much light, and you can blind someone by putting them in darkness. And our problem in the payments industry is we've given people too much light. We've blinded them. We've got too much of choice, too many apps and channels and products. And if you look at the number of players involved, you can see that the challenge that you've got is a very fragmented space. It's very similar to cybersecurity. The biggest risk in cybersecurity is actually not technological. That's not the problem. The problem in cybersecurity is actually the people. The users are the biggest issue in cybersecurity, not the technology. So if you want to fix cybersecurity, fix the people. If you want to resolve the payments industry, fix the people. And so we're going to talk about this in a lot more detail. If you think about the evolution of payments and the financial services industry in fintech, the future is actually already here, right? Work from home has been possible for 20 years. I know this because I was part of the team that launched BlackBerry in 2003, and we launched Outlook Web Access in 2002. So we've been able to work from home for 20 years. Nobody did it. It's a social problem. It was important, but it wasn't urgent. It's only when it became urgent that we adopted work from home. And we see the same thing happening with technology adoption in fintech. The future is here. Everything that we want to do, from democratization of equity funding to financial management services through aggregators, through AI for investment advice and blockchain, all of these things are possible today. The problem is not what's possible. The problem is, how do you get people to change their behavior? It's a social issue. It's a behavioral change issue. It's not a technology issue. Even crime syndicates have figured this out, and even crime syndicates are moving on from card now. And in fact, app fraud now overtook card crime fraud in the first half of 2021. So my first big idea that I want to leave with you is actually we all need to be sociologists. We all need to be students of society and how to create societal change. And I'm going to talk more about how one does that and the way in which we should be thinking about people in payments, because the biggest issue in payments is actually not technology, it's people. I'm going to be using this framework a lot today. I'm going to draw a difference between communication, cooperation, and collaboration. You see, when people communicate, these banks and regulators and merchants and payment service providers and consumers, when you communicate, people communicate with multiple goals and multiple agendas. When you cooperate, you tend to have one goal, but you still have multiple agendas. When you collaborate, you have one goal and one agenda. So part of the challenge in the payment space is we actually don't have a lot of collaboration. We've got a lot of communication and cooperation. And in my third bullet point, in fact, my third big idea, I'll share with you why that's such a bad thing when we look at what happened with COVID, because this is exactly the problem that we had with dealing with the COVID crisis. So in fact, I'm going to be using the word collaboration a lot. And machines don't collaborate, people collaborate. And in fact, the payment industry worldwide is rapidly moving from communication to cooperation to collaboration. That's an enormous change that's happening. And folks, it's a social change. It's not a technological change. So let's look at the second big idea. The second big idea is we've all tried to go our own way. And in fact, you can't go your own way, no matter what the words of the song say. If you look at what's happened with the evolution of payments, there's a land grab myth. And the land grab myth is, well, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, JCB, China Union Pay, well, they've always owned the rails. And as we move forward, we started to see this gradual fragmentation. And we've seen this explosion of different players in the space of payments over the last 20 years or so. And so the view now is, well, actually, because of smartphones and the commoditization of payments, there's now a land grab, and everybody's trying to build their own rails, and everyone's trying to build their own payment service provider system, and everybody's trying to build their own wallets and their own float systems and do their own settlement and account recon. The problem is that this introduces massive challenges. And part of this, of course, is the fact that, well, we've got this balance in the world between fear and greed, right? We are fearful that if we don't do something, it's going to be a monopoly. And of course, there's an opportunity, so everybody dives in. Well, the balance between fear and greed, folks, is a social problem. It's a social problem that's caused this. If you assess the level of readiness of financial service industries between banks and regulators in Africa, you'll actually find that most players in Africa are rated at the bottom left-hand corner of this. In other words, if you look at the innovation and digital readiness score versus our agility score, most South African banks sit at the bottom, and most European banks sit at the top. And so the challenge that we have is we're actually not ready for this, right? Not only are we not ready from a behavioral point of view, we're not ready from a technological point of view as well, or even an organizational point of view. And so we're going to have to work together to fix this, which brings us to the second piece of the cooperation versus collaboration puzzle. You see, the challenge we've got is today we've got split accountability. So if you look at, again, communication, cooperation, and collaboration, today accountability in the payment space, well, it largely has been individual accountability. Banks are responsible for their piece, and payment service providers are responsible for their piece. And when we cooperate, well, that's also true. We still remain like that. And retailers will hold each person responsible for their little piece of this. Well, when you start to collaborate, you start to get group accountability. And group accountability requires that we start to trust each other. And we trust that all of us are going to be doing what we said we are going to do. Well, that's a social problem, right? Because now we've suddenly got to change the way we've always worked for maybe 70 years. The way in which we learn, for example. When you're just communicating, well, you've got complete independence. When you start to cooperate, if you've ever done a syndicate project at university, you've got partial interdependence. Well, when you start to collaborate, you've got complete interdependence. We're totally dependent on each other. And so we're starting to see this happen in many spaces. And in fact, my next big idea is going to pick up on this, in fact, and build on that and show you the consequences if we don't get this right. And again, I want to emphasize the point, it's a social problem. It's not a technological problem. And so the big idea that really I was building up for in the last two ideas is the lesson that we learned from COVID. You see, because COVID, if you think about it, the big idea is actually, just like health, payments is a common good. It's something we share, like sunshine and clean air and clean water and a pollution-free environment. The big idea is actually we all have to work on this together. And if you don't work on this together, you've got a free rider. So, people will come and fish outside your borders because, well, they don't care. It's a free rider problem. The free rider problem means, well, it's a common good. So there's always going to be, and you see this on the internet, right? You're always going to see a bandwidth hog who's going to suck up all the internet bandwidth in your neighborhood if you don't have a fair use policy. So let's look at what happened with health, because we were largely in the communication cooperation space and not in the collaboration space. And because COVID is a sad metaphor for what happens when we don't get collaboration right. Because you see, just like in payments, people are producers of the virus and they're also consumers of the virus. You see, people are producers of money and they're consumers of money. We are initiators of payments. We are receivers of payments. And so it's really important to understand what happens in a world where people are both producers and consumers. And here's what happened. On day 600 of the battle against COVID, we started out with a land grab. Now, this word land grab, you might recognize in the payment space. What happened? Well, nations started hoarding ventilators. It was a land grab for ventilators. Then we started hoarding PPE, personal protection equipment. Well, that's a land grab. Then we started hoarding vaccines. Well, we still got right now vaccine apartheid, where the bulk of folks in emerging markets have not got access to vaccines. We know, if you look at the resistance that's been building up, initially there were COVID skeptics. Then we had vaccine skeptics. Then we had anti-maskers. We had ivermectin promoters. And we've got a whole bunch of alternative facts that are rolling out because we're not cooperating. We're not collaborating. We're not even communicating properly on COVID. You can now start to see the problem. If you're not communicating properly and you're not cooperating properly, you're really going to struggle to collaborate. We've become very parochial. Everybody's looking inward. So you've now had multiple national lockdowns starting at different times of varying severity globally. And you've had a fragmented vaccine passport approach, which is looking like it's going to be a disaster. Again, because of a lack of collaboration. There's no international approach towards a vaccine passport. And the consequences of this are delayed resolution of the problem. You've got a variant evolution, and we don't know what the next variant is going to be like. In fact, we're hoping that we're crawling out of this. But because we haven't collaborated on this, there's a very real risk that you're going to have another variant. All of this, of course, has created greater polarization and politicization. Now, this should resonate for you in the payment space, because this is exactly what happens in the payment space. And by the way, this is not a technological problem. This is a social problem. Remember, the virus cannot move unless people move. So if the world had been able to collaborate on a 14 to 28 global synchronized lockdown 600 days ago, this would have been over. But how do you get all of these folks to agree? And that's the problem. Right? The problem is that health is a common good. And because everyone's struggling to get to collaboration, which requires a massive level of trust between us, we never got there. And so the consequences, and it's really an interesting metaphor to look at what happened in COVID and look at what's happening in the payment space, because you see exactly the same thing. Because we're not able to synchronize and collaborate and get a common agenda and a common goal, which is exactly the problem in COVID. We couldn't get a common agenda and a common goal. Everybody said, well, my nation first, or my company first, or my people first, or my business first. Well, the minute you do that, or my industry first, you've got a problem. You're going to end up with this kind of problem if you do not put the global good first. A social problem, not a technological problem. And so if you look at what happened in COVID, you look at learning, right? When you are cooperating, well, you get information transmission. You move information between countries. You have knowledge transmission. As we learn new things, we send them. But we don't have we don't have knowledge generation. We don't generate knowledge together. Inquiry is individual. Each country is doing its own research. South Africa is one of the leading developers of information on new variants because of the work we've done on HIV and TB. We've got one of the best monitoring systems for blood and infections in the world, actually. So we tend to pick up variants first, as we have individual inquiry. And so when you start to cooperate, what should happen in the world is we should be delegated. We should have been delegated to investigate new variants, because actually we're very good at that. That's not what happened. In fact, what's happened is we've been penalized for picking up the variants first, which shows you the danger of having no collaboration. What should be happening is common inquiry. Right? The world should be getting together and saying, look, folks, how do we deal this thing together? How do we make sure that we have a single view of new variants? We don't have that. Decision making, in communication, we agree to disagree. In cooperation, we vote, which is majority rules. But you see, when you collaborate, there's a problem with vote because 51% of people can move it. You see it in America now, right? It's such a polarized country, right? With 51% of people voted for a change in government, and all of a sudden, you've got a highly polarized country. What you really want is social negotiation for consensus. Well, that's how the South African Constitution was developed. It wasn't developed on a. When we voted at CODESA for the South African Constitution, we didn't vote on the basis of majority. because then, whites, Indians, and colors would have had no say in the Constitution. That's not what happened. What happened is we said we want sufficient consensus. We want to hear the quiet voices in the room. And so in COVID, you're not getting to collaboration. And you're seeing this massive fracture that's happened in the world in the last 600 days. And you see a very similar thing happening in the payment space, which is why I'm very excited about the fact that the Reserve Bank has kicked off the move towards a new payment body in the country. And I wanted to share this with you because it's a real issue that reflects the fact that the challenges in payments are actually social issues. They're not technological issues. Now let's look at the fourth big idea. And the fourth big idea really talks to the fact that, like COVID, right? COVID, people produce COVID viruses and people get infected by the COVID virus. Well, it turns out that that is actually a very powerful idea because that idea applies to everything in the world today. You see, if you look at the world today, we are all producers and consumers. In fact, we are prosumers. We are prosumers. We produce and we consume, all of us. It doesn't matter whether you're the regulator or the government or payment service provider or a merchant or a consumer or a bank. You are all prosumers. You produce and you consume. And the role of people in payments is actually evolving fairly rapidly into us becoming prosumers, producers, and consumers. Now that may feel like an alien thought. How can someone be a producer and a consumer? Well, actually, you're all producers and consumers. You probably don't realize it. But if you look at Facebook, right? Facebook is the biggest publisher in the world, but none of that content that they publish is theirs. It's yours. So you publish on the Facebook platform. The same with Twitter, right? The same with blogging, the same with YouTube, the same with TikTok, the same with LinkedIn. It doesn't really matter. All of the content on that platform is produced by the people that also consume it. So in other words, these platforms are all producer-consumer industries. The people that produce it also consume it. So in other words, everyone on the platform is a prosumer. Today, my house is running completely off the grid. And in fact, Eskom is my backup. So I am a consumer of electricity, but I'm also a producer of electricity. I pump my power back into the grid and my estate buys the power from me. I'm running a power station in my house. I'm no different to YouTube. Okay, so in other words, I'm a producer and a consumer of power. I'm a producer and a consumer of content. I probably read, I don't know, 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 articles a year on LinkedIn. I get 10 million views on LinkedIn. So I'm a producer and I'm a consumer on LinkedIn, prolific in both cases. Now, this concept of prosumer is very powerful, right? Because we're starting to see this affect many industries. And it has a huge impact because people are changing, and it has a huge impact on the way in which you design new services. The first thing that's very obvious here, if you live in a world of prosumers, you can't just invent stuff in a back room. You can't build payment products in isolation. You have to fundamentally change the way in which you think about payment products. And you've got to, in fact, not just payment products, you think about everything. Okay, because the consumer is actually part of the creative process. So a prosumer is a customer who participates in the creation of products in an active and ongoing way. And we're all prosumers today. You see, if you're in the producer domain, everything lives with the producer. The producer decides what gets made. If you move towards the consumer domain, the consumer starts to say, actually, I don't like the way you've put this payment button. I don't like the fact that I've got to key in my CVC number and my name as on the card and my expiry date of my card and my card number, and I've got to accept terms and conditions. It's ludicrous, right? So nobody's thinking about the consumer. The consumer is saying, I don't want to make payments like this. This is ridiculous. I don't know anyone in any person I know of who for the last 10 years enjoyed keying all that rubbish into any internet website. Okay, and I've built internet websites and payment platforms, and it's very clear that we're running a producer-driven domain in a world which is moving rapidly towards prosumer. So how do you fix this problem? Well, there's that horrible word again. You fix this problem with collaboration. And collaboration is, I'm sorry if I'm boring you, it's a social problem. Collaboration is not a technology problem, it's a social problem. So if you want to fix this problem, You're going to look at the people in payments and the way in which we work with them. It's a fundamental change in the way we think about the payment industry. In other words, consumers should be far more involved in the design process than they have been up to now. How do we do that? Well, if you think about this, the problem is when producers produce stuff, they invent. They invent things. They don't innovate, they invent. And the reason that most new products fail, the bulk of new products fail. Go and look at the large number of payment products in South Africa that are living there. If there was a graveyard of dead payment products, it'd be very full of coffins of payment innovation. Why? Because most of it was tech push, producer-led, producer-driven. And it was tech push, producer-driven. It wasn't a prosumer view. It wasn't an innovation. It was an invention. And you see, innovation is not just invention. Invention can be a piece of innovation. By the way, innovation doesn't need to involve invention. Often there's a lot of copying that goes on, and you could in fact steal something from somebody else. I think they, you're stealing with pride, I think is a very well-known comment in the telecommunications industry. And so what we see is we see us moving towards a more collaborative way of working. So when we start with partnering with customers, firstly, it's all about communicating. Then it's about coordinating. Then it's about cooperating. And finally, it's about creating. But when you get to creating, that's actually quite complicated, because now what you're saying is, I'm going to partner with everyone in the ecosystem, and we're going to create together, including the customer. Okay, now you get an increasing complexity of partnership and an increasing complexity of consumer issues that you're having to deal with. Again, this is quite a serious social challenge. It's not a technological challenge. So how does one do that? Well, one does it with human-centered design. You start with people. And step number one is you start with trying to figure out who is the person and what problem did they wake up this morning and what job are they trying to finish and complete today. I'd like to pay all my traffic fines because I have to go and renew my driver's license. So you try to renew your driver's license and you haven't paid your traffic fines. You can't. It's not possible, right? So you empathize with me, and do you know when I find out that I can't pay my traffic fine? When I'm in the traffic department, in the queue at the counter. And the teller says, I'm really sorry, sir, but you're going to have to go and pay your traffic fines before you can pay for your driver's license. So step one is to empathize. Who is this customer? And then to define what problem they're trying to solve. What exactly is this problem that they're trying to solve? Well, the problem I'm trying to solve is I'm standing right in front of the counter and I'm trying to pay traffic fines. And the only way I can do that is to leave the counter and walk down to the ABSA branch and then to go and pay my traffic fines at the ABSA branch and stand in a queue there. So now what you're going to do is figure out, well, how many ways are there of solving that problem? Well, one of the ways of solving it is to give you a better way of paying. But that kind of misses the whole point. The point is, surely you should know, because you got a copy of my driver's license, shouldn't you know when my driver's license expires? Shouldn't you be able to ping with my permission my traffic fines? Shouldn't you be able to tell me that actually what you should do is you should be paying your traffic fines before you go in to pay for your driver's license? Then you should prototype that and test it, because the chances are very good that your prototype's going to be wrong. And then you should test it, because the only way to build something that really works in the payment space is you got to build something that does three things. It's got to be viable, feasible, and desirable. Viable meaning it's got to be financially viable. I've got to be able to make money with this. It's got to be desirable, which means people will think it's sexy and they'll use it. And it's got to be feasible, which means it's got to be technically feasible. It must be possible to build this. Well, take the example that I've given you, which is, the reason I gave you the example, by the way, is my wife was having to renew her driver's license. And I mean, if you've all been in this space, you know exactly. It's impossible to renew your driver's license. I'm not going to tell you how we did it, but we got it done in an hour. It did involve having to fly to a different part of the country to get it done, right? Privately DM me and I'll tell you how to do it in 2 hours. The point I'm making is she was in that part of the country and she hit that problem. And the problem is the systems are badly built. So there's a payment problem embedded in a customer journey map that is horrifically complicated and totally destroys your day. And so if you could build this, if you want to get to a solution that works, I promise you, solve this problem. There's millions of South Africans and people around the world who will say, wow, I would adopt that problem immediately. Because like Google says to me when I reverse my car out my driveway, Herman, I'm assuming you're going to work, you're going to arrive at work in 40 minutes. Why can't we do that with payments? Okay, you should be telling me about my payment challenges before I experience them. You've got to design for users. And that means that you've got to start to kind of figure out, how do I get into my customer's mind? How do I understand their frustrations? How do I understand their gain points and their pain points? And how do I really understand that the job they're trying to do? And finally, how do I get their personal stories? I gave you a personal story today. I promise you that there are thousands of stories like this. You must, and the key point here is you should design with users, not for users. And so people in payments are really quite a powerful thing. And by the way, I mean, I look at a lot of payment solutions, and it's very obvious to me that people haven't done this. We've designed for users, but not with users. A good example of this, by the way, was what Apple did. You know, Apple, the biggest single product success that Apple had for 10 years was the iPod. And if you went back and looked at the iPod, you'd see that the Apple iPod was something like 25% to 30% of Apple sales and Apple profits came out of this device. This physical thing was a thing. And Apple made 25 to 30% revenue out of this. And Steve Jobs says, let's kill it. Let's kill it, right? Because he said, actually, an iPod is a music service, and a music service shouldn't be a thing. We already have a thing. It's called an iPhone. It's actually a piece of software. What we really want is digital rights management. We want to be able to digitally secure the music and content and stream it. That's what consumers want. Consumers don't really want to download the stuff anymore. So he said, why don't we take a product and turn it into a feature of a platform? Take a product and turn it into a feature of a platform. So in other words, he said, what if music wasn't a product, it was a feature of an iPhone? And so don't think product, think customer, think system, think platform. And so what he did was he killed his most successful product. It was an astonishing thing. I've never seen anything that brave before in my life. You have to remember how many billions of dollars got wiped out. And here's the point, of course, this wasn't led by the iPod division. The iPod division would never have led this. This was led by Steve Jobs himself. That's bravery, that's vision. He said, what problem are we trying to solve for the customer? Well, the customer is having to carry two devices. I mean, I had two devices. He said, that's a pain point. Why don't we really take the music and put it into the iPhone, and then we solve the big pain point for customers with a single seamless user interface. Today, Apple Music is the second most used service in the world. If you follow me on LinkedIn, I posted the latest stats for music apps. Spotify is still #1. So the key point here is, if you think customer, you will do things like this. And prosumer thinking leads you there. And we need to start thinking like this, because in the long run, payments are going to become a feature of somebody else's platform. It's not going to be a product. Payment's not a product. Payment's a feature. And over time, that's what consumers want. You may think it's a product. Consumers don't think it's a product. Nobody wakes up in the morning thinking, oh yes, I've got payments to do. Nobody does that. It's not a product, it's a feature. And if it's a feature, in fact, it's a feature that could actually become invisible. Because in fact, it's like my toll fees. I mean, I drive through because I've got an e-tag. The reason I got the e-tag is not because I support the toll road system. I just don't want to be bothered with having to stop and pay someone. It pays automatically. So I've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. I want to just wrap up with my last two big ideas. Clearly, collaboration is a big solution. What is the power of collaboration? Well, why do we collaborate? We collaborate because none of us are as smart as all of us. None of us is as smart as all of us. And together we're far smarter than any one of us. The problem is, of course, we're all the many startup founders on this call who think they're the smartest people in the room. And, faith and self-confidence is a startup's superpower, and they need to be like that. We shouldn't change that. But the key point is that actually, if we work together and collaborate, we can come up with much better ideas, especially in a knowledge-based economy. Collaboration is probably the single most powerful thing we have to do as a human species. We've always collaborated. It's what led to the rise of humans. We wouldn't have been able to kill these things, these mammoths, if we hadn't collaborated. Collaboration is inherently in our nature. Okay, I know the Springboks haven't collaborated well the last 2 weekends, and I think there are questions to be asked there. But we have always collaborated. And here's the full diagram. Collaboration has always been important. It's not been urgent. It is now urgent to collaborate for knowledge generation, not information transmission, for moving from individual inquiry to common inquiry, moving from agreeing to disagree. That's not good enough. You know, when people say, I don't want a vaccine, well, I'm sorry, you can't agree to disagree because the vaccine, the virus is going to grow in you and we're going to get a new variant. You can't agree to disagree. You can't say, I'm not going to protect my system with this encryption protocol. You have to. You're the weakest link, right? So we need a social negotiation to a consensus. We can't have multiple goals and multiple agendas. We need one goal and one agenda. We can't have individual accountability. We need group accountability. And we can't have learning relationships that are completely independent. We need to be completely interdependent. We all need to live on the right-hand side. Too many things in the world are becoming tightly coupled. And in a tightly coupled world, like health and payments and logistics, it's not good enough to communicate and cooperate. You have to collaborate. And it's a fundamentally new form of behavior, which, Jon, is a social problem. And the problem we have to solve is, as I've said, it's about human behavior. So let's borrow something from nature in wrapping up. What's my last big idea about people in payments? My last big idea is really that disparate sectors, right, require value exchanges between pieces of the platform. Going forward, in fact, we're all going to be part of the same ecosystem. We're all going to be inside. It's going to be circular creation, not linear creation of value. We're all going to be inside the tent. No one's outside the tent. Everybody's inside the tent. It's a shared platform. We own payments jointly, right? And the best analogy is in nature. As if you look at a coral reef, the reason that coral reefs are such beautiful things is they're an ecosystem. The word ecosystem doesn't come from tech. The word ecosystem means ecological system. That's where the word comes from. It's a biological word that's existed for 100 years, way before Facebook and Google and PayPal came along. An ecological system, an ecosystem, is a self-sustaining structural and functional interaction between living and non-living components. Now, there's all sorts of stuff on a coral reef. It's sustainable, meaning that no one thing kills it. Everything's living for mutual benefit. What the one passes as waste, the other eats as food, right? And so they conserve energy within the system. They find the best way in which to utilize energy. It's a closed loop system. It's symbiotic. Everybody's helping everybody else. In fact, they clean each other. Tortoises come in and they get cleaned up by the other fish. And it's a thriving area of life. If you get this balance right, ecosystems are amazing. And there's multiple ecosystems in the world. The Australians have the coral reef, and South Africans, of course, have our own fynbos ecosystem, which is astonishing. Right? People don't realize this, but it's a very unique ecosystem only found in South Africa. And so today we move towards digital ecosystems where we start to connect all of these things to create a combination of multiple players within the overall system. And so what are the pieces of this ecosystem? Because this is what it takes to win. Yes, there's strategy and there's technology. Everyone thinks about that. But here's what people don't think about, right? No one thinks about the fact that ecosystems operate because they're open. They operate because of the way in which partners trust and collaborate through relationships between each other and the way in which value is exchanged. I mean, Apple is now being sued by Epic Games, largely because the value exchange was flawed. The way in which they took value on that platform, on that ecosystem, right? It's almost like humanity moved to a coral reef and started mining it, right? There's too much. The value exchange is too one-sided, and so it destroys the coral reef. And it's, of course, there's a whole bunch of issues around complexity and industry, which I'm not going to go into. But there are many dimensions to building a business ecosystem, and I believe what is happening globally is payments are turning into a global ecosystem. You're moving from a linear creation of value, which is linear in one way, you produce, you distribute, you market, you get customer, to a two-way and circular way of creating value, a platform-driven business model where on the platform becomes the way you get to the ecosystem. That's why you need a platform. That's how you access the ecosystem. because it's an ecosystem of prosumers, producers and consumers, all living within a circular environment, not a linear environment. And in the past, we thought of payment systems like this. It's a completely illogical way to think of payment systems. They're circular, they're not linear. And so if they're circular, you can turn them into full ecosystems that become highly sustainable over time. So you build a platform to access the ecosystem. There's a company, there's a platform, there's the ecosystem. And the platform is merely a tool to let the firm access the ecosystem and the ecosystem to reach the firm. So the key message, I think people don't get this, is there's no other game in town. If you're not building platforms, you've got a real problem, because you see, linear organizational structures evolve linearly or logarithmically, but platform organizations evolve exponentially. The growth rate, the performance on a platform system is astonishing, and it improves radically over time. Have a look at the number of customers serviced by one employee, right, at Ant Financial. Now, Ant Financial is part of Alibaba. One employee services 133,000 banking customers, right? Citibank, one employee services 1,000. I did the math for Standard Bank. One employee services 150 customers, 150, which means Alibaba is 1,000 times more efficient at servicing customers than Standard Bank is. And by the way, the figures of Standard Bank and ABSA and Capitec and Nedbank and FNB are all the same, right? If you look at the number of customers versus number of employees, you got a huge problem here. Right? These companies, all banks logically should be platform businesses, because they're going to get taken out if they don't become platform businesses over time. Right? You can't hide behind regulation. Your consumers want this. Regulation is not going to save anyone. So the problem you've got is this is a highly dangerous diagram, right? Because it shows you the enormous improvement. I'll go back one slide. It shows you that platform-enabled organizations are exponentially better than organizations that are not platform-based. And in fact, platform-based organizations are ecosystem-based, and they operate on collaboration, and they operate on an ecosystem, in a circular ecosystem, which is open. And here's what happens, right? When you do this, when you build businesses like Alphabet and Facebook and Apple, the revenue per employee becomes astonishingly high, right? I mean, Apple's generating $1.9 million per employee. You know, banks, this curve carries on. I cut it off. There are no banks or payment systems here that I can see, right? I mean, PayPal is an ecosystem-based exponential platform business. And that's why PayPal earned the right to be here. So platforms allow firms to access the ecosystem. And clearly the world we're heading into, whether you're an acquirer, a network provider, issuer, gateway, or an ISO, clearly you're going to be in an ecosystem. Because people want collaboration. If you look at, Apple, for example, and you look at how much of their business is physical products versus software versus platform services, you can see there's the platform piece. Look at Amazon, there's the platform piece. Look at Microsoft, there's software, there's platform. Now look at telcos, look at automotive, look at financial services. You can see most of their businesses are product-based. They're not platform-based. And so the big challenge in the world, folks, is this move towards platform and ecosystem is accelerating very, very rapidly. And so my key takeouts, you're looking at a social problem. People in payments is a social problem. It's huge. We've seen what happened with COVID. We've seen what happens when you don't collaborate and you only cooperate or you only communicate and you try to go your own way. You create a total fracture, which creates a suboptimal operating model. Prosumers are the future, and we've got to think about how we're going to work in a producer-consumer world. Collaboration is clearly the solution, and of course, there are many energy optimizing solutions in nature that really add a lot of value to this. So folks, thank you very much. I hope that you found that useful. Quite clearly, the biggest problem in payments is in fact people. And the challenge going forward is going to be, how do we in fact ensure that we integrate people at all levels between design and operations and even innovation going forward, so that we create systems that are far more people friendly, human centered, and sustainable over time. Thank you very much for your attention.